For 30 years, her killer lived free, smiling at neighbors who never knew. But the river remembered, and one day it spoke. Dawn Maguar vanished on January 27, 1973. A 20-year-old mother, last seen leaving a supermarket in Aso, Michigan. Then nothing. That winter morning began like any other in the small farming towns of mid-Michigan. The air was thick with frost, the kind that burned your lungs and numbed your fingertips even through gloves. The radio murmured faintly about gas prices and the Vietnam War, the hum of static blending with the steady rhythm of snow against the window. Somewhere beyond those broadcasts and quiet kitchens, two brothers, Wayne and Bill Summers, trudged through the maple grove behind their family's farmhouse. The buckets they carried clanged softly against their knees, the metal echoing through the frozen trees. Their father had sent them out early to check the taps for syrup. It was maple season, though it hardly looked like it. The ground was still hard with ice, the snow more gray than white. Breath rose in pale clouds from their mouths, the only movement in a still forest that hadn't yet decided whether to wake from winter. Wayne was the first to stop. He frowned, squinting through the mist. Something ahead broke the rhythm of trees and branches, a shape lying wrong on the forest floor. "Bill," he whispered, but his younger brother had already seen it. They approached slowly, their boots crunching over frozen leaves. The closer they got, the clearer the shape became, blue fabric, torn, half covered with melting snow. Then a pale hand. Bill's bucket dropped, hitting the earth with a metallic ring that shattered the silence. He turned and ran. Wayne stood frozen, staring at what he had found. The still body of a woman lying among the leaves, as if she had fallen asleep in the cold. No one slept like that. Not in winter. Not in the woods. He didn't know it yet, but the brothers had just found the body of Dawn Maguar, missing for 36 days. 36 days earlier, Dawn Maguar had stood in the warmth of her small kitchen, sunlight slanting weakly through frosted glass. Her baby boy, just 1 year old, sat in a high chair, slapping his hands against the tray as she fed him. The house smelled faintly of oatmeal and baby soap. Her husband, Donnie, had already left for work, leaving behind a half-empty coffee mug and the faint scent of motor oil. Dawn moved easily through the rhythm of her morning, humming softly, cleaning, folding, preparing for another cold day. She was the kind of woman who loved routine. Small joys, small duties, all performed with quiet care. At 20, she had what she'd always wanted. A husband who adored her, a son who laughed whenever she entered the room, and a modest home that felt like the whole world. But the cupboards were getting bare. She needed groceries. Their car was with Donnie at work, so she called a family friend to borrow a pickup truck for a few hours. "I'll be quick," she'd said with a laugh. "Just a few things for dinner." That dinner would never be made. At 3 p.m., she entered the Aso supermarket, a low, fluorescent-lit building off Main Street. The aisles were lined with canned goods, paper towels, and the faint scent of cleaning solution. She smiled at the cashier, waved to a friend, and filled her basket with the things she needed. Baby food, bread, chicken, a few vegetables, and Donnie's favorite, a box of lemon pudding. The friend later remembered their conversation. She seemed fine, happy. She said Donnie had been working late, and she wanted to surprise him with dinner. The receipt timestamp read 3:24 p.m. No one saw her again after 3:30. By evening, Donnie returned home to an empty house. The lights were off. The baby was asleep in his crib, but the air felt wrong. Too still, too cold. Dawn should have been there. Dinner should have been cooking. At first, he told himself she'd stopped somewhere. Maybe a friend's house, maybe to visit her parents. But as hours passed, dread took root. He called the family friend who'd lent her the truck. "Is Dawn still with you?" The answer made his stomach drop. "No," the friend said. "She hasn't come back." At 9:47 p.m., Donnie called the police. By midnight, officers were combing the supermarket parking lot. The truck was still there. Inside were the groceries she had bought, neatly packed, untouched. The keys were scattered on the ground beside the driver's side door. Not dropped, scattered, like she'd struggled. It was the kind of evidence that screamed without sound. By dawn the next day, the quiet community of Aso was awake. Word traveled fast in small towns. By noon, 4,000 volunteers had gathered: farmers, teachers, students, housewives, factory workers. People who had never met Dawn but couldn't bear to imagine what had happened to her. They spread out across fields and frozen rivers, calling her name until their voices cracked. Dawn! Dawn! The sound echoed through trees, fading into the wind. Television crews arrived. Newspapers printed her wedding photo, the smile of a young mother whose life had barely begun. The headline read, "Missing. Young woman vanishes after grocery trip." Days turned into weeks. The snow melted, then froze again. And every night, Donnie left a lamp burning in the window, a light for the woman who never came home. When Wayne Summers called out for his father that March morning, his voice carried across the frozen field. Within an hour, police cars and news vans lined the narrow country road. Yellow tape fluttered weakly in the cold wind. The body was found near the edge of a slow brown river, the current barely moving beneath the ice. Someone had tried to hide her beneath a blanket of leaves and snow. But winter is an unforgiving keeper of secrets. Even after 36 days, the cold had preserved enough for identification. The blue fabric, her coat; the gold band, her wedding ring; the face, unrecognizable but unmistakably human. The police confirmed it later that day. It was Dawn Maguar. News of the discovery spread through Aso like fire through dry grass. Businesses closed early. Church bells rang. Mothers wept quietly as they watched the broadcast. Fathers locked doors they'd never locked before. Fear had a new name. Dawn's family gathered at the small white house where she'd lived. Donnie didn't speak. Her mother held her son, the baby too young to understand why everyone was crying. Her father stood at the window, staring out at the snow, his hand trembling as he reached for the curtain cord but didn't pull it closed. Somewhere beyond that window, the river flowed, silent, slow, and indifferent. That was where she had been found. That was where the town's innocence had ended. March 4th, 1973. By late afternoon, the Summers farm was unrecognizable. The quiet woods now crowded with patrol cars, detectives, photographers, and reporters shouting questions no one could yet answer. The smell of gasoline and wet leaves hung in the air. The frozen ground, once the playground of two boys, had become a crime scene. Wayne Summers sat on the back step of a pickup truck, knees pulled to his chest, staring at his muddy boots. He was 13. Bill was 11. They didn't speak. Their father stood nearby, talking to police, repeating the same details again and again. The buckets, the path, the blue fabric. The officers nodded, scribbling notes, their faces pale beneath the weight of what they'd found. The coroner's van arrived just before sunset. Cameras flashed. The boys watched silently as the stretcher was lifted from the woods. A single white sheet covered the body. Someone whispered, "That's her." No one needed to ask who. In a small room inside the Shiawassee County morgue, the medical examiner worked quietly through the night. Every detail mattered. The cold had preserved much of the body, but the truth still hid beneath layers of ice and time. By dawn, he had his answers, the kind no one wanted to hear. Dawn Maguar had been raped. She'd been shot 3 times, twice in the head, once in the back. The bullets were .22 caliber, small but lethal at close range. 2 were Remington brand. 1 was Winchester. That inconsistency caught the examiner's attention. Killers rarely mix ammunition brands. He noted something else: the approximate time of death. Within 90 minutes of her disappearance. While the entire county had been searching, Dawn had already been gone. Her body had been placed carefully, not dumped. Someone had taken the time to cover her, a futile attempt to make the woods forget. But the woods never forget. The investigation became the largest in the county's history. The Aso Police Department, Shiawassee County Sheriff's Office, and the Michigan State Police joined forces. The case file grew thicker by the hour. They started with the obvious leads: Dawn's husband, Donnie. In every disappearance, the spouse is questioned first. Detectives arrived at his home the morning after the discovery. Donnie answered the door with dark circles beneath his eyes, his hands trembling. He didn't resist. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He simply said, "Tell me what you need." His alibi was airtight, confirmed by his employer, co-workers, and time cards. He'd been at work the entire day. He wasn't the suspect they were looking for. Next came the search for witnesses. Police canvassed the supermarket parking lot. They spoke to cashiers, customers, delivery drivers. No one had seen anything. No screaming. No struggle. No tire tracks that led anywhere useful. The lot had been busy. A dozen cars, people coming and going. And yet somehow no one noticed a young mother being taken in broad daylight. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The truck Dawn had borrowed was towed to the station. Technicians combed through it inch by inch. The groceries were still intact, frost-covered from the cold. Her purse was missing, but the baby food and lemon pudding were there. Reminders of a day that should have been ordinary. On the ground beside the truck, the keys told their own story. They weren't dropped in a neat pile. They were scattered wide, uneven. Investigators recreated the throw. A right-handed person, grabbed from behind, pulling away, could have sent them flying just like that. The driver's door bore faint scratches near the handle. No forced entry, but maybe a struggle. The snow around the tires was disturbed, footprints overlapping. The prints were partial, melted, refrozen, impossible to match. Still, detectives photographed everything. They collected samples of dirt, fibers, and anything that might carry a trace. Inside the morgue, evidence technicians preserved samples from Dawn's body, swabs, hair, trace fluids. In 1973, they couldn't test DNA. They stored them anyway, labeling each one carefully, for future analysis. No one then could imagine how important that would become. ASO had always been a trusting place. The kind where you left your car unlocked and waved to every passerby. But after Dawn's murder, that trust evaporated. Women started carrying keys between their fingers like makeshift weapons. Parents refused to let their daughters go anywhere alone. The supermarket parking lot, once filled with chatter and grocery carts, grew eerily silent. One store manager recalled, "People started looking over their shoulders. The whole town changed overnight." Newspapers ran daily updates. Local television stations aired her story every evening. Murder of a young mother, killer still at large. But behind the headlines, the investigation hit wall after wall. There were no eyewitnesses, no fingerprints, no useful tire impressions. The detectives had only fragments, a body, bullets, and a truck. 15 months later, in June 1974, a fisherman casting his line into the Shiawassee River felt something heavy snag his line. When he reeled it in, it wasn't fish, it was metal. Rusted. Heavy. A revolver. The police diver team confirmed it. A .22 caliber handgun. It had been submerged long enough for the barrel to clog with mud. But 3 bullets were missing from its cylinder. Remington. Winchester. The same combination that killed Dawn. The gun's serial number was still legible. Investigators traced it to a pawn shop in Yuma, Arizona, sold 8 years earlier to a man named Robert Shaw. When they found him, Shaw appeared calm. He admitted he'd once owned the gun, but claimed it had been stolen years ago. No record, no police report. "I didn't think it mattered," he said. He couldn't explain how his gun ended up in a Michigan river, thousands of miles away. Shaw became the prime suspect, but the evidence was too thin. Without witnesses and without technology to match the gun to the bullets definitively, they couldn't charge him. He walked free. 3 years later, in 1976, a farmer clearing brush near that same riverbank found something half buried in the mud. A small, leather wallet. Inside were photos of a smiling young woman, her hair in soft curls, holding a baby. Her driver's license read, Dawn Lee Maguar. The discovery reignited the investigation, but like before, the trail went cold. The police had more evidence, but no answers. The river, it seemed, gave up its secrets slowly. The 1980s arrived with new faces in the police department and old boxes collecting dust. Detectives retired, cases were reassigned, and the Maguar file sat in storage. Thick, yellowing, but never forgotten. Each January 27th, her mother, Eleanor Swan, stood outside that same supermarket, holding a candle. Sometimes a few people joined her. Sometimes no one did. She came anyway. "Someone knows something," she said each year. And she was right, because somewhere in that same town, a man carried the weight of what he'd done. Quietly, invisibly, convinced the world had forgotten. He was wrong. By the late 1990s, forensic science had changed. DNA testing was no longer science fiction. It was a weapon. Across the country, cold cases were being reopened, one file at a time. In 2001, a young detective named Lisa Harding requested access to old evidence boxes in the Shiawassee County storage facility. When she opened box 17, labeled Maguar, Dawn, 1973, she found something remarkable. Preserved biological samples, sealed and intact. She sent them to the Michigan State Crime Lab weeks later. The results came back, a full DNA profile. It matched someone already in the federal database. The name, Robert Shaw, the same man who'd claimed his gun had been lost. Robert Shaw was 71 when the police came to his home in 2002. He lived quietly, retired, mowing his lawn every morning, waving at neighbors who thought he was harmless. When officers arrived, he didn't resist. He simply looked at them and said, "It's been a long time." He confessed within hours. He'd been driving through Michigan for work, saw Dawn in the parking lot, followed her, waited until she was alone, and forced her into the truck. He never explained why. Afterward, he panicked. He dumped her body in the woods and threw the gun and wallet into the river. For nearly 30 years, he'd lived free, attending church, hosting barbecues, babysitting grandchildren, carrying the truth like a shadow. When asked why he finally confessed, he said only, "I couldn't sleep anymore." In 2003, the court found Robert Shaw guilty of first-degree murder. He died in prison 4 years later. For the Maguar family, justice came late. Too late for Dawn's father, who died still searching for answers, and too late for a town that had learned to live with fear. But when Eleanor Swan heard the verdict, she wept softly and whispered, "Now I can rest. Time moves on, but rivers remember." For 30 years, the Shiawassee carried fragments of Dawn's story beneath its surface. The gun, the wallet, the truth. Each piece rose when it was ready, when the world had finally caught up. Evil hides best in plain sight, but truth always finds a way to the surface. When the police packed up their evidence and the headlines faded from front pages, life didn't return to normal. Couldn't. For the Maguar family, normal had been buried with Dawn. The house that once smelled of baby lotion and Sunday dinners now felt like a museum of silence. The ticking clock in the hallway grew louder with each passing night, marking time that no longer made sense. Dawn Maguar sat in the same chair every evening, staring at the empty side of the table. The lemon pudding she had bought still sat in the refrigerator for days before he finally threw it away. It was supposed to be dessert for that night, the night she never came home. At 23, Dawn was a widower, a husband with no wife, a father learning to raise a baby alone. He tried to be strong the way everyone told him to be. He kept working, kept showing up, kept answering questions from neighbors who meant well but never knew when to stop talking. God works in mysterious ways, they said, but mystery was a cruel comfort. At night, he'd wake to the sound of his son crying. For a split second, he'd expect Dawn to stir beside him, to whisper, "I've got him," but the bed was always cold. He'd lift the child, hold him close, and whisper promises he wasn't sure he could keep. "You'll know your mom," he'd say softly. "I'll make sure of it." But as the months stretched into years, Dawn's voice became harder to remember. Her laughter faded into a sound Dawn could only half imagine. He carried guilt like a scar. If he hadn't worked that day, if he'd driven her himself, if he'd done anything differently, maybe she'd still be alive. Logic told him it wasn't his fault. But grief doesn't listen to logic. It rewrites reality until pain feels like punishment. Dawn's mother, Eleanor, was 45 when she buried her daughter. The funeral was small. A gray sky, a few neighbors, and a casket that felt too wrong for someone so young. Eleanor stood beside it, one hand gripping the edge until her knuckles went white. She didn't cry. Not then. Not yet. Afterward, she went home and walked straight to Dawn's childhood room. She opened the window, letting the winter air in, and whispered, "I'll find who did this." She meant it. While others tried to move on, Eleanor couldn't. Every January 27th, she stood outside the ASO supermarket with a candle. Sometimes 10 people joined her, sometimes just one. But she came every year, wearing the same brown coat, holding the same photo of her daughter, the one with the soft curls and the hopeful smile. "Someone knows something," she would tell reporters. "Someone always does." Over the decades, her hair turned white, her hands shook, but her resolve never weakened. She kept Dawn's old bedroom exactly the same. The posters, the stuffed animals, the perfume bottle still half full on the dresser. Sometimes she'd sit on the bed and talk as if Dawn were there. "You'd be 40 now," she'd say softly. "Your boy looks just like you." And every night before bed, she prayed the same words, "God, don't let me die before I know the truth." Ralph, Dawn's father, dealt with grief differently. He didn't pray. He investigated. He built a map in his garage, pushpins marking every place connected to the case. The supermarket, the parking lot, the river, the field. Red strings connected them like a web only he could understand. He clipped newspaper articles, copied police sketches, and made lists of suspects no one else believed in. When the police stopped calling, he called them. When detectives retired, he wrote to the new ones. His friends told him to rest, but Ralph couldn't. He believed if he stopped searching, he'd be betraying his daughter. He spent nights in his truck, driving the same routes the killer might have taken. He'd pull over, sit in silence, and stare at the dark highway, wondering if the man who killed his little girl had ever felt guilty. He died in 1988, clutching a folder of notes on Dawn's case. The last thing he said to Eleanor was, "Don't stop. Promise me." She promised. Dawn's two brothers, Max and Larry Swan, were young men when she died. Larry, 2 years older than Dawn, had always been her protector growing up. When kids teased her, he was there. When she got married, he was the one who walked her to the altar, smiling despite the lump in his throat. After her death, he changed. He stopped joking, stopped smiling. He joined the local search teams for missing persons, helping other families find what his could not. Each new case reopened his own wound. Each discovery reminded him of the day the police brought his sister home in a box. Max, the oldest, turned to faith. He believed everything happened for a reason, even if that reason was hidden. He helped raise Dawn's son, teaching him how to fish, how to pray, how to remember the mother he'd never know. They rarely spoke of her directly. It was too painful. But sometimes, when the boy laughed, Larry would glance at Max and say quietly, "That's Dawn's laugh." By the time Dawn's son, Daniel, was old enough to ask questions, the story had already become legend. Kids whispered about the woman by the river, about the mother who vanished. But to Daniel, she wasn't a legend. She was the woman in the faded photograph on the mantle. Every birthday, Eleanor lit an extra candle, one for the daughter she lost. And every year, Daniel blew it out for her. When he turned 10, he asked his father, "Did she love me?" Donnie's voice broke when he answered, "More than anything." Daniel carried that answer like armor. He grew up quiet, introspective, often visiting his mother's grave without telling anyone. He'd sit for hours, tracing her name with his fingers, whispering things he wished she could hear. When he graduated high school, he placed his diploma on her headstone and said, "I did it, Mom." The world changed. New stores opened, old buildings closed. Cars got faster, radios louder, technology smarter. But inside the Swan family, time barely moved. Dawn remained 20 forever. Every new decade brought another reminder, another unsolved anniversary, another winter without answers. But grief has a way of shaping people without breaking them completely. Donnie never remarried. He couldn't. He said once, "I met my forever at 20. She just didn't get to stay." Eleanor lived to see her 70s. Her hands trembled when she lit candles, but she never missed the vigil. And when the call finally came in 2002, when detectives told her they'd found the man, she didn't cry at first. She just whispered, "I told you. Someone always knows." When the trial began, Daniel was 31. He sat in the courtroom, staring at the man who'd stolen everything from his family. Shaw looked old, thin gray hair, hands shaking, but Daniel saw only the monster behind the years. The prosecutor read the evidence aloud. The DNA, the gun, the confession. When the verdict came, guilty of first-degree murder, Eleanor finally allowed herself to weep. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked how she felt. She smiled through tears and said, "It took 30 years, but God keeps receipts." In the spring of 2004, Eleanor and Daniel visited the river where Dawn was found. The water ran smooth and quiet under the morning sun. Eleanor tossed a white lily into the current. Daniel followed with another. They watched the flowers drift away, two small reminders of a life once lost, now at peace. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and maple sap. Eleanor closed her eyes. "She's free now," she said. Daniel nodded. "So are we." She vanished on a winter afternoon and was found by a river 36 days later. For decades, the truth slept beneath ice and silence. But rivers never forget. They carry the weight of what we bury, and when the time is right, they bring it back. This is not just a story about death. It's a story about love that refused to die and justice that refused to stay silent. Because time can blur memory, but it can't erase truth. And the truth always finds its way home, even if it takes 30 years and a river to tell it. Even after justice was served, Aso, Michigan never fully went back to sleep. The town had learned something about itself, something that could never be unlearned. That beneath its quiet streets, beneath the Sunday church bells and neighborly waves, darkness could live quietly, politely, unnoticed. For a place once known for maple syrup festivals and high school football, the name Dawn Maguar became both a ghost and a prayer. Every generation that followed inherited her story the way others inherit family recipes or old photo albums. In the years following Robert Shaw's conviction, the town tried to move forward. The local newspaper stopped printing the story every January, and new families moved into the houses that once lined the search routes. But for the old residents, her memory wasn't something you read about, it was something you felt. The supermarket where she vanished was remodeled, its aisles rearranged, its sign repainted twice. Yet no one could stand too long in the parking lot without glancing at the corner where her truck had been found. Employees said even after 30 years, the cold wind seemed sharper there. Some nights, when the air was still, older shoppers swore they could hear the faint sound of clanging metal, like two buckets echoing through the woods. Every January 27th, candles appeared again. At first, it was just Eleanor Swan, her breath visible in the winter air as she stood outside the supermarket holding her daughter's photo. But after the verdict, more people came, neighbors, teachers, even the children of those who'd once searched the woods in 1973. They brought flowers, prayers, and sometimes just silence. The vigil wasn't about sorrow anymore. It was about gratitude, that truth had outlived lies, that light had outlasted shadow. The local news covered it once more, calling it the town that never forgot. One reporter asked Eleanor what kept her coming back every year, even after all this time. She smiled faintly, her voice soft but unwavering. Because the world forgets fast. But love shouldn't. The Shiawassee River had been both witness and accomplice, holding secrets no one else could. In summer, children fished along its edges again, laughing, splashing, never knowing the history beneath the water. But for the older residents, it was sacred ground. Some refused to go near it at all. Others went there to pray. Local churches began hosting a candle by the river night each spring. Families would float white lilies downstream, each one representing someone lost, to time, to violence, or to memory. Dawn's lily always drifted first. There was something poetic about it. The same current that once carried evidence away now carried remembrance forward. In 2015, a high school English teacher named Mrs. Harmon introduced her students to a local history project. Their task was simple: write about an event that changed the town. Most wrote about the factory fire of '92 or the drought of '81. But one student, a quiet boy with brown hair and kind eyes, turned in an essay titled "The Woman by the River." He wrote, "I never met her, but she's part of my family. My grandmother says everyone here owes her a candle, because her story taught us to protect each other better. I think she saved more lives than we'll ever know." The teacher later learned that the boy was Dawn's grandson. Dawn's childhood home still stands on Maple Street, white paint fading, porch steps creaking with every wind. When Eleanor passed away in 2006, Daniel inherited it. He kept it the same, even the old furniture his grandparents had left behind. The walls still carried the faint scent of cedar and the soft hum of time. In the corner of the living room, on a small wooden table, sat a single framed photograph. Dawn holding her baby, sunlight spilling through the window. Daniel never replaced it, never needed to. He said once in an interview, "People think stories end when justice comes. But sometimes, justice is just the start of healing." Today, children in ASO learn about Dawn Maguar the way others learn about local heroes. Her story is told in classrooms and during town parades. The high school scholarship fund for women in criminal justice bears her name, the Dawn Maguar Foundation. Every year, one student receives a scholarship with a note that reads, "For those who shine light where others look away." It's small, but it matters. Because in a town where one woman's disappearance once inspired fear, her legacy now inspires courage. Detective Lisa Harding, the woman who reopened the case in 2001, visits ASO every few years. She's often invited as a speaker at the annual vigil. She always stands quietly at the river before the event, watching the water, remembering what it gave back. In her speech one year, she said, "When I first opened that old box of evidence, I didn't know what I'd find. But I knew one thing: love leaves a trail. Sometimes it's hidden under snow, buried in files, or forgotten in storage. But it never disappears. Not really." People say she cried for the first time that night. Eleanor never saw the internet, never used a cell phone, never lived to see the true crime documentaries that would later feature her daughter's story, but she would have been proud. When the producers interviewed Daniel for a national series about unsolved murders finally solved by DNA, he spoke softly into the camera. "She used to tell me, 'The truth will find its way home.' She was right." They titled the episode "The Woman by the River." It reached millions of viewers, far beyond Michigan, and letters began arriving from people who'd lost loved ones decades earlier, thanking the family for giving them hope. Eleanor's promise had outlived her. Years later, when Daniel visited the river again, older now with silver in his hair, he stood quietly on the same bank where his mother had been found. The water was calm, the air warm. He closed his eyes and whispered, "I forgive you," though he wasn't sure to whom he was speaking: the killer, the town, or the years that had stolen so much. Forgiveness, he realized, wasn't about letting go of pain. It was about refusing to let pain define everything that came after. He tossed a single lily into the river and watched it drift, carried by the same current that had once hidden everything, now revealing what time had restored: peace. Time didn't heal the wound. It simply taught ASO how to live with it. For 30 years, a mother searched, a father hunted, a husband mourned, and a town held its breath. And when truth finally surfaced, it didn't erase the sorrow, it honored it. Because memory, when shared, becomes something larger than pain. It becomes legacy. Dawn Maguar's story reminds us that justice can sleep, but it never dies. It waits. In rivers, in files, in hearts, until someone cares enough to look again. The story of Dawn Maguar did not end with the conviction of her killer, nor with the quiet fading of news headlines. It continued, not in the courts or police archives, but in the quiet moments that lingered long after. in the way a town learned to lock its doors, in the way mothers watched their daughters cross parking lots, in the way investigators spoke of hope not as wishful thinking but as duty. Even as years turned into decades, the echoes of that winter in 1973 rippled outward, shaping things unseen, laws, lives, and legacies. Because some stories don't fade, they evolve. By the mid-2000s, the Maguar case became a reference point in forensic science courses and police seminars across the United States. It was the story every new detective learned, of persistence, of patience, and of the way technology could rewrite the past. The preserved evidence from 1973 became a textbook case study in chain of custody integrity. In conferences, crime lab directors spoke her name respectfully. The case that proved saving everything could save someone. Soon after Shaw's conviction, Michigan established one of the first statewide cold case DNA initiatives. Over the next 10 years, more than 200 unsolved homicides were reopened and solved. One detective later said, "Every time we matched a new DNA sample, we thought of Dawn. She was the proof that old ghosts can still speak." In 2010, a documentary filmmaker named Rachel Porter visited ASO after reading about the case in a university archive. She expected to find an old file and a forgotten river. Instead, she found a community still glowing with remembrance. She interviewed Eleanor's neighbors, the now-retired officers who'd searched in the snow, and Daniel, who agreed to speak on camera for the first time. His voice trembled, but his words were steady. "I used to think my mother's story ended with her death. Now I know it began there, because it changed people, even people she never met." The documentary aired nationwide under the title, The Woman by the River. It reached millions, inspiring viewers to volunteer with missing persons networks, to advocate for cold case funding, and to reopen their own family mysteries. Letters poured in, from daughters searching for mothers, from brothers searching for sisters, from detectives who'd lost faith but found it again. Dawn's story had become more than tragedy. It had become a call to action. ASO itself began to transform. The local university opened a small forensic science resource center, partially funded by donations made in Dawn's name. The first lecture given there was titled, "How a River Taught Us to Listen." Students analyzed mock crime scenes on frozen fields, learning how weather preserves and conceals truth. They walked the same woods where Wayne and Bill Summers once carried metal buckets. The Summers brothers, now gray-haired men, returned for the opening ceremony. Wayne spoke briefly, his voice cracked only once. "We were just kids when we found her. For a long time I wished we hadn't. But now I understand. Someone had to find her. And I'm proud it was us." Across America, new laws emerged. The Preserve Evidence Act required local law enforcement agencies to maintain biological samples indefinitely for all violent crimes. The bill's first draft cited the Maguar case, 1973 to 2002, as precedent. What had once been a story of sorrow had turned into a foundation for reform. Every time a detective lifted a sealed envelope from a cold case box, every time a scientist prepared an old swab for testing, Dawn's presence lingered, invisible but undeniable. Even the way investigators talked about victims changed. No longer cases. They became people, deserving not just of justice, but of remembrance. By 2018, Daniel Maguar was 56. His son, Evan, was grown, a police sergeant in Detroit. When reporters asked why he'd chosen that path, Evan smiled gently. "I grew up hearing about one crime my whole life. Maybe I just wanted to stop the next one." That year, Daniel retired early from his job at the automotive plant and began volunteering with victim advocacy groups. He spoke at universities, prisons, and memorials. In one talk, he told a room full of young officers, "You'll meet people whose pain is older than you. Don't look at them with pity. Look at them with respect. They carried something you couldn't see, and they kept walking anyway." His voice had the same calm rhythm as the Nest Stories narrations that would later adapt his mother's story. Steady, patient, filled with grief and grace. In 2021, heavy rains flooded ASO. The Shiawassee River swelled beyond its banks, reclaiming land that hadn't seen water in decades. Houses were evacuated, roads submerged. When the water receded, it left behind branches, debris, and one small, rusted metal tag, stamped with the words, "Evidence, 1973. Police confirmed it had washed loose from an old storage crate decades ago. To the townspeople, it felt like the river's final whisper, a reminder that no matter how much time passes, truth will always find its way to light. The tag was placed in a glass case inside the new forensic center, beneath a plaque that read, "For Dawn, and for every story that waited to be heard." 50 years after her death, Aso was no longer just a town with a tragedy. It was a town with a memory, and with that memory came empathy. New mothers told their daughters about Dawn the way others spoke of saints. Teenagers walking home from school kept their eyes open, not in fear, but in awareness. Teachers told students that knowing someone's story was a kind of protection, that indifference was how monsters hide. And every January 27th, as snow settled softly on the quiet streets, candles still flickered by the river. Not out of grief anymore, but out of gratitude. Near the river, there is a bench with a bronze plaque. Eleanor Swan. She promised and she kept it. Visitors still leave flowers there. Some fresh, some artificial, some just wild daisies gathered from the road. Children ask their parents what it means. The parents tell them, "It means love doesn't stop working when the world does." Sometimes, people sit there without speaking, listening to the current, the wind in the trees, and the quiet that feels less like emptiness and more like peace. She was one life among millions, a mother who sang to her child, a daughter who loved her parents, a wife who never made it home. But because her family refused to give up, because a town refused to forget, because science refused to stand still, her story changed the world. In 1973, she vanished. In 2002, she was avenged. And in the years that followed, she became a voice for the voiceless. The river that once hid her body now carries her name. The cold that once silenced her cries now keeps others safe. Time didn't erase her. It echoed her. Through every file reopened, every mother protected, every truth finally spoken. Because the dead only vanish when the living stop telling their stories. And in Aso, Michigan, they never stopped. If this story moved you, share your thoughts below. And if you want to join us for more stories like this, subscribe to the channel and walk with us as we continue to remember those who can't speak for themselves.